you.
Okay, Boker Tov, everybody. Welcome to the Torah Motion Zoom channel. Boker Tov, Erev Tov, depending on where you are at this moment. Welcome to part 4 of our introduction to Midrash. Just a little note to remind you, we have our 2 shiurim, special shiurim on Thanksgiving for the American citizens. Non-American citizens are welcome to come, even if they don't eat turkey. That's 11 a.m. Zev Elif will be giving a shiur, getting a foothold in America, something like that. Coming Jewish immigration to America, religious, whatever, the issues they had to deal with, and that'll be followed at 12:30 by Ari Zivatovsky, who will be giving, who's the expert in the field, really on the kashrut of turkey and other exotic animals. So we'll have a doubleheader on Thanksgiving. I do point out you do have to register separately for that. The registration link for this class will not work if you try for that class. So please do register. Take you a minute, and we look forward to seeing you at all the classes, inviting friends, tell people know all the wonderful things, all the learning opportunities we're trying to come and provide. So with that, Simi, we're looking forward to part 4. I'm just going to put the link to our source sheets there. They were sent out in the email, and they'll be shared on the screen. Vakasha.
Okay, so let me start by saying I kind of threw you people into the deep end here when I did the last mashal that we did last time, and one of the participants raised a question, so I want to go over it again just very briefly, not the whole thing, but to remind you what Midrash is doing and to sort of see what this particular Midrash is doing. The reason we started with the parable, with the mashal genre, is because by its very nature, a parable is interpretive. It requires us to compare and contrast texts. It's set up to do that. It's set up to make us think about this is like this in this way, which also means this is unlike this in this way. So far, so good. We're good. We get that? Okay. It's a method that the Midrashic sages use because it requires the reader or the listener to engage in the act of interpreting and drawing conclusions and understanding things. Now, I finished last week with a particularly difficult mashal, a difficult parable, and it was difficult for 2 reasons. One reason is because understanding the mashal, understanding the parable, requires us to carefully understand 2 verses from 2 different places and see what they mean in their original context and see what the sages are doing with those verses to create a particular literary effect, right? Is this making sense so far? The other difficult thing is that what this particular parable does is it starts out placing us in sympathy with one personality in the story. And then when we get to the nimshal, which is the unpacking of the parable, it reverses our sympathies, okay? So let's think about where we started. The verse that we started with was, how did she sit alone, right? The city. Haitake almana, she was like a widow. And the Midrash wants to know, what does it mean to be like a widow as opposed to being a widow? And we were given 2 opinions that we looked at. One is a Rabbi Chama Bar Ukva, who says basically, she sits like a woman who is still yearning to be married to her husband, even though he has died and he is gone. That was the first reading, right? The second reading gives us a sort of quasi-divorce situation. A king who divorces his wife, but then snatches her bill of divorcement from her, right? And in that case, and when we go through the whole thing, our sympathies are reversed. We see a man who does not want to be divorced from his wife, who was unfaithful to him, who wants from him what she does not really deserve, okay? Now, it's hard let's separate that from a modern day divorce scenario for a moment. We're going to put that aside because that could confuse us. if we read that mashal, if we read that parable, we end with the following understanding. In what sense is the lonely city, Yerushalayim, the Jewish people, in what sense is she like a widow? She's like a widow from the perspective of her husband. That is to say, he never wanted to divorce her. He never wanted her to leave. He still feels attached to her. That's the difference of opinion in the two. How do we get there? We get there by looking at the way in which the parable gives us one picture of the relationship, and the unpacking of the parable gives us a different perspective on the relationship. So Ruth, did I answer your question? Yes? Okay, good. All right. So like I said, I kind of threw you in on the deep end. I know that's hard. It's a little frustrating because, there's so, I'm trying to cram a year-long course into 6 sessions, obviously. But let's talk about another question, which I think is sort of central to our understanding of what Midrash is. And here we're going to be talking not about the Midrashic Parable, because the Midrashic Parable is, in one sense, pretty straightforward. It's a purpose-built story. It's presented to us as a fiction, right? Somebody designed this story to make us think about similarities and differences between different texts, okay? But when we get to other kinds of Midrashim, this is where people throw up their hands in despair and tend to say, I don't know what's going on here. This is where people say my least favorite phrase in the world, which is, it's just a Midrash, okay? Which makes me crazy for all sorts of reasons, and I hate it, and all of that. It's right up there with the sink is full of dishes, that's right up there. Okay, but if we come back to this, it's just a Midrash, okay? Where does that come from? The answer is that one of the things that makes Midrash study so difficult is that we are not used to the use of figurative language to convey complex philosophical ideas, okay? And here, to really understand what's going on, we have to look at the Rambam. The Rambam is probably the clearest expositor. He's not the first, but he's the clearest expositor of this problem. The question is, I'm going to use a code word here. How many of you are familiar with the Midrashic idea that Vashti had a tail? A show of hands. Vashti had a tail, you remember that? Your kids came home with pictures of Vashti to color in with the tail, the whole thing, right? Vashti had a tail, Vashti had a tail. That's one of those right there. Another one, I'm sure you could, each person here could probably come up with a favorite, what am I supposed to do with this kind of Midrashic story? Am I correct? And maybe we'll take votes for what is my least favorite Midrashic story at the end of the shiur. But we're going to use Vashti had a tail as our, Rivka is 3. Yeah, that's a big one. Rivka was 3 years old. Okay, I actually just taught that. I'm not going to do it now. We're not going to do it now, but I actually just taught that to my Midrash class at Nishmat. What we're going to talk about now is how are we to relate to statements that seem fantastical, problematic, crazy. What are we supposed to do with that? So the Rambam actually, in his introduction to Perek Chelek, he wrote a series of introductions to his commentary on the Mishnah. On the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin, Perek Chelek, he wrote a discussion of this question. Basically, what are we supposed to do, or how are we supposed to understand when Ghazal, when the sages of the Midrash, the Talmud, tell us fantastical stories. Okay, so he says there are 3 fundamental approaches. And basically, when we cover these 2 of the 3, I think you'll see where we're going with this. And I will take questions as we go along, but we'll start with the first. He says the first group of people take literally statements like Vashti had a tail. Okay, in other words, They read it, they hear it, they read it in a sermon, they hear it they see it in the Gemara, they hear it in a talk, they see it in a commentator or in Jewish, discussion of Jewish thought. Vashti had a tail, and they take it literally. Vashti, that means if Ghazal say that Vashti had a tail, Vashti had a tail. And why do they take it literally? He says because there are basically two things happening here. One is that no one has ever taught them a different way of relating to the text, right? If Ghazal say, you daven between this time and this time in the morning, and Vashti had a tail, those statements are equally factual, right? And that's because essentially their approach to Ghazal is one of respect, right? Because they wouldn't, he actually makes the point of saying they would not take it literally if they read it in the newspaper. He doesn't say if they read it in the newspaper, but he says, if anyone else were to tell them some of the things that you read in Ghazal, their approach would be, this is nonsense, it's ridiculous, I don't believe this. But since it is Ghazal who say it, they assume that they're obligated to take these words literally, and so they do. Okay, so that's the first group, and I'm sure we know people in that first group. And what he basically says is they need to be given other kinds of intellectual tools for understanding how to understand Ghazal. But in his view, they are better than the second group. The second group are the people who consider themselves educated, intelligent, intellectual, philosophical thinkers, right? They also take the words of Ghazal literally. If Ghazal say Vashti had a tail, they assume that Ghazal mean Vashti had a tail. However, instead of accepting that, they mock the sages, they make fun of them, they reject them, because their assumption is that the sages were primitive. He says they're even worse off than the first group, right? The first group doesn't understand that they are devaluing Ghazal, they're devaluing Midrashic authors when they take them literally, and they take them literally out of respect. The second group takes them literally out of mockery and assumes that they are greater than Ghazal, right? In other words, I have a PhD in sociology, I am greater than Rav Ashi, to reduce it, okay. And then he explains something very, very interesting without actually asking our question, which is, why do Ghazal use stories like this? Why do they use figurative language? Why do they tell us fantastical things? Why do they tell us that Rivka was 3? Why do they tell us that Vashti had a tail? What's going on over here? And he says the following, and here I'd like to sort of paraphrase more directly what he says. He says that this, I would call them the pseudo-intellectuals. That's my term, it's not his. He actually does. He says they're actually an accursed, a bastard offshoot of Greek philosophy. He calls these people sort of like an outgrowth, a bursting out of what the original Greek philosophers were. They're not real philosophers. They only think they're philosophers. But he says the following. He says that if these people understood that the Chachamim were practical philosophers, they would understand what is going on. And this is, I think, a brilliant, brilliant way for the Rambam, for Maimonides, to tell us what is going on. He says the following. He says, if you knew how to write philosophical and theological matters in language that could be accessible to both the philosopher and to the ignorant person or the child, you'd be a genius. And that's what he says Ghazal are doing. In other words, he calls them practical philosophers. What's the difference between Ghazal and the original Greek philosophers? They roughly cover the same period, or certainly there's overlap between those periods. The difference is that the philosophers were speaking to philosophers. The sages of the Talmud, the Midrash, were teaching Torah, and they were speaking to everybody. If you want to convey a complex philosophical or theological idea to a philosopher, you write philosophically, and then you can't teach that to children, and you can't teach that to people who don't know how to understand philosophical language. But if you want to give everyone access to a complex philosophical idea, you have to find a mechanism that is accessible to the simple person, let's say the child or the unsophisticated listener, and to the sophisticated person. And that mechanism is story, parable, allegory, figurative language, symbolism, metaphor, all of the things that Ghazal use in their teaching of different ideas, okay? And what he essentially says is that Talmud Torah, or teaching complex philosophical and theological ideas for the Chachamim, for Ghazal, is not meant to be an elitist experience. It's supposed to make room for everybody. It's supposed to make it as accessible as possible to everybody. Okay, we're going to stop here for just 1 second, and I just want to make sure I'm going to summarize, and if there's a question, I'll be happy to take it, a question or two. I want to make sure we cover this. The Rambam is saying, Maimonides is saying that when you hear, and we're going to see he elaborates this more in the third section of his argument. He's saying that the reason, if our question is, what's with the Vashti had a tail? What's with the Rivka was 3 years old? What's with the other, your weird favorite Midrash, right? What is it with that? The answer is, that is the way in which Ghazal make sure that they are conveying complex ideas in a way that are accessible to everybody. Okay? Okay. Can I go on, or do we have questions? Quick questions.
If
Rabbi
I
Cohen?
may, yeah, I'm looking here. Nobody asked a question, but of course, that doesn't explain the Midrash, why they picked 3. And that was the Rambam, of course, assumes that Rivka wasn't 3 and Vashti did not have a tail, and he considers it.
So that's the third section. That's a third section. We didn't say that. I just want to make sure that.
Okay, fine.
Okay, just the first 2 sections here. Are the first 2 sections clear? Yes? Okay, so let's go on. So when we go into the third section, then the Rambam really fleshes out his approach to this matter. And he says that the first thing you have to understand, or one of the things that he's very biting about people who don't agree with him, which, by the way, I mean, 99% of the Rishonim, definitely agree with the Rambam's approach. Okay, so actually it was okay. He says, look, the person who hears Vashti had a tail, we're going to use that as our symbol of this kind of mashal. The person who hears Vashti as a tail, who is taking the right approach, understands that Vashti as had a tail, is actually not meant to be taken literally, but is he says, has a plain sense meaning and a hidden meaning. Okay, now this Vashti had a tail is a parable, a form of parable or riddle. It doesn't mean Vashti had a tail. Hiding behind the statement Vashti had a tail is a concept. And that concept is presented in a way that the sophisticated listener understands that he has to unpack it. Should I say that again? Okay. Let's go back to our mashal, let's go back to our parable understanding. When we read a parable, we know that it's a fiction, right? And the fiction is there to help us think about what the verses mean. We would agree, right? It asks us to compare, to contrast, to think about the language, to think about how things work, okay? He's essentially saying the same thing about fantastical statements like Vashti had a tail, or Midrashim where the letter Aleph speaks, or the moon has an argument with God, or etc., etc. You get the picture. All of those midrashim that make you crazy are all, he's saying, a signal to the sophisticated reader that you have to unpack what's going on here. Right? This is a kind of riddle or a puzzle for you. This is a kind of parable for you. It's a figurative use of language. You have to decode it, unpack it, and translate it into your own idiom. Okay? Now, what then is the value of that fantastical statement? Well, the value of that fantastical statement is that a child or an unsophisticated listener will grasp something, if not much, of the sophisticated message that lies behind. Okay, so let me see if I can give you an example just from elementary school education. When you're a little kid, your teacher tells you have to eat lunch. Everybody has to eat lunch because the body is like a car, and a car needs fuel, your body needs fuel. You have to eat lunch so that you can have fuel to run like a car. Okay? That's nonsense. That's complete, literal, total, absolute nonsense. Your body is nothing like a car. Eating lunch isn't like putting gas into a gas tank. It's just nonsense. It's ridiculous. Okay. Have you, though, told the child something? Have you told the child something that they need to hear? Is there some sort of idea, or kernel of an idea that he can grasp at the level at which you say to him, your body's like a car? Will he turn around to you in high school and say, you lied to me? And then when he does a PhD in molecular biology, will he say to you, that was cruel and evil and wrong? You shouldn't have told me that the body is like that. No, because as his understanding grows, what will he understand? That the body isn't like a car. I know more now, but I get the idea that the teacher was trying to get across, which is you should eat because your body needs food or something like that, right? Also because the teacher needs 15 minutes without total craziness, okay? But that's pretty much what you have here, okay? Now the body, your body is like a car is not at the level of sophistication of the way that Ghazal used language. But what he's saying is you have to relate to the sophisticated reader or listener has to relate to Vashti had a tail in something like the way the sophisticated adult relates to your body is like a car, right? That's what he's saying here. And if you stay at the level of Vashti had a tail means Vashti had a tail, okay, you're not going to get very far. On the other hand, there is an idea that's being conveyed here. So let's think about that for a moment. And here again, I want to point out that very often Midrashim are taken out of context. Midrashic sources are taken out of context. We all know Vashti had a tail because the kids came home with pictures of Vashti and the tail and the whatever, and they remember Vashti had a tail, and they talk about Vashti had a tail. But in fact, it appears in two places that I know of. One is in Targum Sheni, and one is in Masechet Megillah, the tractate Megillah, where, by the way, it is bracketed, right? It's not a smooth reading of the line, it's bracketed, which indicates that perhaps there are manuscripts that didn't have that statement, but it actually says when King Achashverosh tells Vashti to come to the feast naked, right? She doesn't come. Why? Because the angel Gabriel came down and affixed a tail to her, and she was ashamed or embarrassed, and she didn't want to go. Or basically, this is the formulation, if I'm not mistaken, it's 5 or 6 words, 6 or 7 words. The angel Gabriel came down and affixed a tail to her. Okay. Now, why do we get that statement? Where's that coming from? What is it meant to convey? Well, what most children will understand, even if they can't articulate it, is that human beings don't have tails. Who has tails? Animals. Okay. So if you are inclined to feel sorry for Vashti, what statement is being made about Vashti? She's an animal, metaphorically speaking, right? She's not, this is not a nice vegetarian lady here, right? This is not a politically correct sweetheart of a human being who got shafted somehow. No, this is a person who deserves her fate. And the idea of the angel Gabriel coming down and affixing the tail to her is a statement that there was something God did behind the scenes to make Vashti refuse to want to go to the king. Because after all, it's pivotal to the story that she be out of the way so that the story can develop as it does. Okay, now, what we had to do to understand this, and we haven't even really looked at the source together, but what we had to do to understand what's going on here was we had to actually look at the source, right? We had to actually go back to Masechet Megillah, look at where it appears, what the context is, and then we had to think about, well, what could be the idea? And maybe there's another way to read this. I don't have a problem with that. The Rambam is making it clear that the way to read it is not that Vashti had a tail, right? That's not an option, okay? But we have to think about what it could mean that Vashti had a tail, okay? And then we have a deeper understanding of the dynamics of the text. Okay, so he also points out something else here, and I think here I'm going to quote Professor Yona Frankel, Alav Hashalom, who was had a very pithy way of explaining things. The Rambam points out that the sages are following in the path of the Tanach. In other words, if you look at the books written by Shlomo HaMelech, right, King Solomon, the wisest of all men, his 3 books were Mishlei, Proverbs, Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, and Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs. Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, is a love poem, which is allegorical. Mishlei, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes are collections of proverbs and statements about wisdom using parables. What he says, riddles, parables. He says at the beginning of Sefer Mishlei, at the beginning of the book of Proverbs. In other words, the book of Proverbs is the use of figurative language to convey complex ideas. Okay, and he says, you know what? Ghazal, the sages of the Midrash, the Talmud and the Midrash, have no problem interpreting parts of the Hebrew Bible allegorically, symbolically, or otherwise. In one example that he gives is the book of Job, right? There's an opinion in the Talmud that the book of Job is a story. It's a fiction created to talk about why the righteous suffer and why the wicked prosper. Okay. Okay, so we're gonna stop here for just a second, and I wanna see if I can tighten this up. This is now I'm gonna quote Professor Frankel. He said, "When God wants to teach us all kinds of complex and sophisticated theological concepts in the Torah, God, we're talking about, not the rest of Scripture, right? Just God, 5 books of Moses. What does he use? Stories. And these are the stories that never stop being studied by everybody. And they grow in depth and understanding, and as we grow in depth and understanding, the 5-year-old who reads about the Akedah or hears the story of the Akedah while he's kicking the boy sitting next to him in the circle, the Gan circle, he hears, I don't know what he hears. If he heard the story, he hears something about how Abraham loved Hashem so much that he was willing to give him the best thing he ever had. The more sophisticated reader knows more. The parent reads it differently. The sage reads it yet differently again. What did someone else say? It's an upside down pyramid, right? There's the biblical text, and then there's mounds, piles, gallons of ink explaining to us the depth and the sophistication of these stories. By the way, I'm just going to point out, there's been a lot of work in recent years about the function, a function of the story in making us human. A lot of interesting books about that. That we are, one of the things that characterizes humanity is that we are storytelling people. We have our own narratives that we write about ourselves. We have trouble integrating. When we have trouble integrating narratives, it's sometimes a sign that there's something wrong with us. We are storytelling people. God is speaking to us. Ghazal say, Dibra Torah kilshon b'nei adam. The Torah speaks in the language of people. And I think part of that is not just using metaphors, etc., but God speaks to us in the language that we intuitively understand from a very young age, which is story. And that's what the Rambam has to say here. So when we're looking at the Midrashic story and we're looking at stuff that makes us uncomfortable, we have to recognize that the Midrashic story is an invitation to interpretation. It's an invitation to think about and invest in the process of figuring out what's the message here. And if it were, or let me see if I can give you this example, another personal bugaboo of my own. You can only teach Ramban's commentary on Torah to adults, to older children and adults. You can't teach it to young children. Why? Because the Ramban writes philosophically. He writes the way we're used to reading serious essays, right? It's very linear. He writes in straight linear prose. Question, answer. Susan, you look confused. Are you stuck or you're following? Did you have a question?
I was typing a question. That's why I look that way.
Oh, okay. I can't do the whole chat thing. I'm sorry. It's my personal,
Then when you're done, maybe I'll ask you it.
Okay. The Seder. When you look at what the Ramban does, what Nachmanides does, is he writes very much the way that we as Western people write. He'll notice a problem in the text. He will bring someone's commentary, or sometimes not. He'll address the question. He will explain in a very linear way. This is because A, B, C, D, right? And then he'll go off on a tangent, or he'll raise another presumed question. And if you will say A, B, C, D, I will tell you G, H, I, whatever, okay? In other words, he writes the way we're used to reading prose argumentation, okay? You can't teach Ramban to children until their Hebrew is good enough and their cognitive abilities are good enough, and their ability to follow an abstract argument. Rashi, on the other hand, who was superhuman as far as I'm concerned, probably the greatest biblical commentator in the whole entire world. Certainly he set the agenda for biblical commentary for the next 1,000 years, quotes a lot of Midrash. He quotes a lot of Midrash or pieces of Midrash. In fact, he uses Midrash as raw material for his commentary, and you can teach it to children. Will they really understand what Rashi's doing? Nah, no. But will they grasp something? Yeah, for sure. For sure. Okay, all right. So if everybody's more or less happy with this explanation, we can move on, because I'd like to do some more text with you, but I will take a few questions if people are interested.
So can I ask my question now?
Sure, go ahead.
So to what extent do you think it's important for us to take these fantastical midrashim and tie them back to the kushiyah and the pasuk? To say, well, why were we talking about Vashti having a tail? Well, it says, Beketer Malchut, to what extent should we be trying to do that?
It depends on the midrash. Some of the midrashim, and we didn't really talk about this, but some of the midrashim are very interpretive. And some of the midrashim are sermons. One of the things that happens is that when you start to read midrash, you become highly sensitized to the texture of the biblical text. All sorts of things you would never have noticed leap up at you because they were very, very close readers of the text. That's Midrashic methodology. So it's on a case-by-case basis, right? There are going to be, you're going to think about, okay, is there a textual basis for this? If there isn't a textual basis for this, is there a larger conception of what the text is talking about here? Or is this in fact a sermon that has no direct connection to the text, right? So what you have to do is start to get used to thinking like Ghazal, picking up their language and sensitizing yourself to the way that they read. And then you can answer the question. It's going to depend on a case. Somebody said to me, why didn't I put in my book the whole idea of, is an idea, Rav Reuven Margolio, The Genius of a Man, wrote a very fine book about how the tendency of the sages to justify the righteous and vilify the wicked in Midrash. He talks about that. He said, well, why didn't you see that as a methodology? And I said, because as great as Margolio's book is, and it is an excellent, excellent book, and if any of you want to read it, I highly recommend it. I think it's a case-by-case thing. There are different reasons why they justify or vilify, and I don't think it's as simple as the righteous and the wicked. I think it's more complex than that. There are schools of thought within the Midrashic genre, in the Midrashic oeuvre. You know, it's not that simple. So the answer to your question is how important? It depends. Sometimes it's clear that something is coming out of the reading of the verse. Sometimes it's clear that it's not really related to the verse. It's something else. Okay? Okay, I'll take 5 minutes for questions because I want to at least start our next piece. Rabbi Kelman, do you wanna?
Okay, let me take a look here. Go back to the top here. Okay, I think we should leave this for the end about Midrashay Halacha. I think that'll take us too far afield. We can come back to it.
Not going to talk about
Ghazal, basically, we're talking the time of the Gemara, let's say.
Right.
But we're talking a couple thousand years ago, up to 1,500 years ago, the end of Ghazal. When did It's Just a Midrash start? I have no idea. The little Midrash says, I don't know where that comes.
When did Just a Midrash
start? I think
start?
somebody's asking, Ilana's asking, when It's Just a Midrash, that phrase you hate, when do people start using that phrase?
Long time ago.
Long time. Too long ago.
Basically, let me just say this. One of the reasons people say it's just a Midrash is because if you don't understand something and you know vaguely that you don't have to take it literally, you think you can dismiss it. But taking something literally and taking it seriously are two different things, right? 100%. In other words, the Midrash is telling us something that may not be factual, but is still deeply true. Right? And I think that we have to distinguish between.
Of course, again, maybe not for now, but many people do many great scholars of Rabbanim Chazal reject other Midrashim. In other words, not every Midrash is accepted by everybody. But that's
what do you mean by accepted?
In other words, somebody say the Midrash, we disagree with the Midrash, the way it portrays it. In other words, you'll have that all the time.
We disagree with the Ramban all the time too.
Yeah,
right. In other words, the Nitziv will say, I'm reading it differently than I don't agree with the Ramban here. Right.
It's not. We don't have to accept every Midrash and take them seriously. Okay, that's another topic. Okay, ultimately, Angel put a tail on Vashti because she was not an animal and would be embarrassed and not come. So she's doing another read on the Midrash to portray Vashti in a more positive light. Yep. Okay. And also the Megillah doesn't tell us she was told to come, naked. I mean, that's based on Becheter Malchut. That's where Chazal get it from.
Sometimes a Midrash is a response to another Midrashic reading. Yes.
Right. And somebody was just asking, doesn't the Maharal take all Midrashim literally? I know he takes it much more literally. I don't know. I'm not expert enough on Maharal. Okay, but he Heschel said that God created humanity because God likes stories. Okay. Stories are more powerful than laws. That's for sure. But
I'm gonna make a statement here that I think is also important, and it's complex. So I'm gonna run this past you also. The laws that are written in the Torah are written almost in story form. I'll tell you what I mean by that. When you talk about an ox that gores, and the difference between an ox that gored once or an ox that has gored many times or more than once, right? You're talking about a category of damages, but you're not writing it in the way that it would be written in a secular law book. You're taking an image that stands in for a category of damages. Or I'll use another classic example, a pit in the public domain, right? Which is a kind, I was always saying to my kids when they leave their junk in front of the front door, I'd say, this is a pit in the public domain, there's a barber shooter, I'll get it out of here, right? It's not, it wasn't technically, but if you look at Parshat Mishpatim, right? If you look at the civil laws in Parshat Mishpatim, many of them are couched in images that encapsulate a category. It's not just an ox that gores. It could be another animal that bites, right? It's not just, frequency or provocation or things like that are also in the mix there. But when you have a picture, an image, a category that stands in, it's memorable. You can remember that. Liability is attached to if you started a fire that went into your neighbor's field, okay? Well, legally, I would imagine an oil spill fits into that category too. The Torah doesn't talk about oil spills, but when you talk about a fire that spreads to someone else's field, you've captured an image that sums up a kind of liability. Is that clear? So in other words, it's not a story. The law is not told in story form, but it is not linear prose lists. It's the encapsulation of a category by an image. Okay? Okay, I'm sorry. Do we have time for more Rabbi Kelman? Should we move
No,
on?
I'd go on that with the source, and we can take any questions. Spend 15 minutes going over the source that I'll
Okay, so let's look at the first the source that I gave you here today. I'm going to open it up. We're going to, in the process of analyzing this source, hang on, I want to, oh, wait a minute. No, I didn't do it right. I have to do share screen, and then I press this, and then I share. Look at that, magic. Okay, makes me feel like Harry Potter. Okay, so what we're going to do today is, or we're going to start to do today, and Bezrat Hashem will continue next week, is we're going to look at a midrashic source, and as we're walking through the understanding of this midrashic source, we are going to look at the process itself, not just what the message is. So I want you to take a couple of minutes, and let's say we'll say 5 minutes to read through in Hebrew or English, whichever you prefer, Genesis 37, starting from starting with the beginning. Take 5 minutes and read it through. With a special emphasis on verses 18 through, with a special emphasis on verses 18 through 24. No, somebody is writing on my paper. Not me. Is that you, Rabbi Kelvin?
It is you. It is you. You're doing it accidentally. You're the only one who has power to write on your paper. That
Okay,
happens
so I'm
once in a
sorry.
blue moon. So you can, I forget exactly, but I think there's like an erase button you have probably on the top.
All right,
you
we don't need it. It's fine. It doesn't matter. Okay.
It's on the blank
Just wanna-
spaces anywhere. It's in the white.
Right.
Have to color it, you know? We're talking about stories for kids. It's perfect.
Stories for everybody, Rabbi Kelvin.
No, kids' stories for adults. Kids' stories are all for Aesop's fables are for adults. They're not for kids. No,
The Aesop's fables don't come to Ghazal's knees.
I understand, but they still have messages. Little Red Riding Hood is for kids. It's for adults, not for kids.
Yes.
Goldilocks,
that's true.
you know. Okay.
Okay, so let us now go to if everybody's more or less read this. I want to go back to the psukim, to the verses up here. I'm sorry, but we're going to take a look at starting from verse 18. Okay, Yosef is coming to his brothers, and pasuk Yud Chet, verse 18 says, "Vayir'u oto merachok," they saw him from afar. "Uveterem yikrav aleihem v'yitnaklu oto lahamito." And before he had drawn near to them, they plotted against him to kill him. "Vayamru ish al achiv," and they said each man to his brother, "Hinei ba'al hachalomot halazeh ba." Here's that dreamer of dreams, this master of dreams coming. Here's that master of dreams coming. "V'ata lechu v'naharbenu," and now come, let us kill him. "V'nashlichehu ba'achad haborot," and we'll throw him into one of the pits. "V'amarnu chaya ra'a chalatu," and we'll say that a wild animal ate him. "V'nir'eh ma yiyu chalomotav," and we will see what will happen with his dreams. "Vayishma Reuven vayatzilehu miyadam," and Reuven heard, and he saved him from their hand. "Vayomer lo nakenu nafesh," and he said, "Let us not kill him." Okay, now let us not strike him mortally. Okay, let's go down to the Midrash here. Vayishma Reuven vayatzilehu, and Reuven heard, and he saved him. Vehechan haya, where was he? Where was Reuben? What's bothering the Midrash here? They see their brother from afar. Do you see it, ladies and gentlemen? I'm sorry. Do you see it, everybody? They see Yosef coming from afar, and they start plotting his death. They're planning to kill him. And then what are we told?
Reuben hears something.
What? Where have you been? Right? That's what the Midrash is saying. What do you mean? You just noticed that they're plotting to kill your brother? Where were you? So we have three opinions here. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Nehemiah, Rabbanan. We have the opinions of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Nehemiah, and the rabbis. Rabbi Yossi Amar, Kol echad ve'echad mehem haya mishamesh et aviv yomo. Rabbi Yossi said, each and every one of them would serve his father on his day. V'oto hayom shel Reuven haya. And that day was Reuven's day. What's the Midrashic answer Rabbi Yossi gives? Where was Reuven? I'll read it again.
With Yaakov. With Yaakov.
He was with his father. He was not physically present. In other words, he reads, and Reuven heard as Reuven was not physically present, and he only hears when he comes up to the brothers, which means that if he heard, it means he just heard. Okay, what's wrong with Rabbi Yossi's reading?
How did he hear?
No, he was with his father, and then he appears on the scene.
Then
Let's read
Yaakov wouldn't have had to send Yosef to look for his brothers.
Exactly. In other words, if we had a situation where, remember, the beginning of the chapter starts with the fact that Yosef is with his father all the time, and Yaakov is sending him to speak to find out how are your brothers doing. Now, if each brother showed up on a different day, why would he have to send Yosef to check up on his brothers? And Yosef, if we read like Rabbi Yossi, and Reuven just shows up at the critical moment right before they're about to kill him and hears what they're about to do and stops it, it's a little hard to reconcile with the rest of the chapter. You see that? Okay, everybody sees that?
I don't,
Okay.
well,
You don't-
I don't even see that there's a problem yet, because the narrative is the two are talking, and the one who hears them talking says to them. I don't.
No. Let's go back to the narrative. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So Yosef is coming and the brothers hear him, right? Verse 19. Verse 18. Vayiru oto merachok, they saw him from afar.
Mhm.
They, meaning the brothers.
Okay.
V'terem yikrav alehem vayitnaklu oto lahamito. And before he had drawn near to them, they plotted to kill him.
Mhm.
Vayamru ish el achiv, and they said, each man to his brother, meaning they're having this conversation. Hinei ba lachalomot halazeh ba. Here's that master of dreams coming. And now let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And we'll say a wild animal ate him. We'll see what he does with his dreams.
So,
Do you see what the problem is? And Reuven heard.
so
What-
the rabbi, so is Rabbi Yossi would have preferred the verse to say Vayomer Ruvain?
Yeah.
That is, instead of Vayishma.
What do you
So he
Vayishma? He seems to imply that he's not listening to what's going on around him.
no,
Do you see?
rather, he is listening, and his reply is,
No, Vayishma Reuven is, and Reuven heard. Not
Yeah.
Reuven is listening. No.
okay.
If it had said Reuven shomea, then we would say, based on biblical convention, Reuven was listening. Vayishma Reuven makes it sound like he just woke up. He just heard it. He just heard what wasn't said before. That's the problem with the Midrash. And I think it fits because after all, think about it this way. Wouldn't it make more sense when they see their brother from afar? They start plotting to kill him. Reuven's the Bechor, right? What should he do?
You'd speak up.
Yeah. So what do you mean? He just heard.
Ah,
Who
so
was
they-
he?
you don't
Was
like,
he Wisconsin? I mean, really?
But how
Okay.
did Yossi know? How did Rabbi Yossi know this? Did he make this up? How did he even conjecture that somebody was with his father? We're analyzing the words, and it's very important. But where did he get that from?
This is Rabbi Yossi's opinion.
That's
Rabbi-
his opinion.
Yeah, there are different Midrashing. There are different sources for Midrashing. Some sources are based on tradition. Some sources are based on svara, how do you say that? On reasoning. So for example, if you had read this in the Ramban, if the Ramban had said something like, clearly based on the verse, Reuven was not present at the time. Possibly he was taking care of his father or something like that. The answer would be the same. That's his conjecture about filling in what's happening here. Does that answer the question? In other words,
No.
in the case of Rabbi Yossi is coming up with an opinion the way that any of the other commentators would later.
I think the problem is, and this is, and first of all, thank you. I've heard you at Matan, and I love you. I have your book. I think you're wonderful, so thank you. But this is something that always, and I'm also doing the Daf with Hadran, and this is something that always gets to me. After we hear this, many midrashim, and then we think that what the Rebbe said, what is said, is not just his opinion, but we think that that's the way it is, and it isn't the way exactly.
Well, let me see if I can say something here.
Mhm.
The fact that you have in this midrash 3 voices saying 3 different things means that Ghazal didn't relate to it that way.
But they
Let's put it this way. Neither Ghazal nor I am responsible for the fact that some of your teachers make you think that everything that you read in the Talmud has to be reconcilable with everything else you read in the Talmud. Ghazal didn't feel that way.
it always perplexed me. And then people took it as that was the law. And then you
No,
can,
law is different. Law is different rules. Law is how do
no,
we,
right, I phrased it wrong, but that's the way it is. This is what it was. Reuben was really by his father when it's only his opinion.
not if you read the whole paragraph. That's the point I'm saying. Very often the commentary that you're hearing or reading
Mhm.
is a snippet of a midrash rather than the whole midrash. The
Yes.
more access you have to the broader context, the better you'll understand what's going on.
So,
Right?
so last week, and I couldn't answer you last week because I really love your share. I was listening to it driving, but my question was, I'll forget it. It's okay. Mhm.
You know what? Let's stop here for a
Oh,
moment.
no, you said that in order to really understand, maybe I heard it wrong. Maybe in order to really understand Midrash, you really have to know the text and you have to hear all of the Midrashim. But unfortunately, no one does. I'm not capable of even doing it. Maybe it would take me a lifetime to do
I
that.
don't know all the text and I don't know all the midrashim either. When I hit a midrash that I don't understand, I have to look at context. Always.
But you could go back to the books and do that. Most of us can't.
Okay, so that's where you have to find a chavruta or a rabbi who can direct you, or but let's do it here.
Go
Let's
ahead.
do it.
I'm sorry.
Okay. So Rabbi Yossi says what he says, and as we can see, that's problematic. So we're given two more opinions. Rabbi Nechemia said, Amar Reuven. Reuven said, Ani bechor, I'm the eldest, I'm the bechor. Ve'en hastirchon talui ela bi. The stench will depend only on me. Stench means the sin. The sin is going to hang on me, right? Now, we have to figure out what this is. What Rabbi Nechemia does here, and this is important for our understanding of the process, is to explain to us what Reuven is thinking, he expands the dialogue, right? He adds, this is what Reuven's thinking, okay? So Rabbi Nechemia said, Reuven said, I'm the eldest. My birth order is very, very important in Tanach, right? And since I'm the eldest, I'm responsible here. I will be blamed for this sin. Now, the question we have to ask here is, how is Rabbi Nechemia understanding and Reuven heard?
It could be
interpreted.
What does and Reuven heard mean?
That he understood the implication.
He understood the implications. Not, see, the way Rabbi Yossi's reading it, it's a physical description, right? Reuven heard, meaning he hadn't heard before. But the way that Rabbi Nechemia is reading it, it means, and Reuven understood. And by the way, not only in Hebrew and not only in English, in many languages, when you want to say, I understand, what do you say?
I hear you.
Or I see, right? Those are common substitutions for I understand. In other words, what Rabbi Nechemia is saying, of course Reuven was here, but he was slow to grasp the implications of what was happening, right? In other words, maybe he can't believe his brothers are actually talking about killing his brother. Maybe, that's impossible, no, this can't be happening, right? Sometimes we're slow to grasp something. Or he's like watching this and he's not really getting it and he doesn't realize that he has to act here. In other words, the way that Rabbi Nechemia reads it is, Reuven understood. All of a sudden, the penny dropped, right? He got it, right? Uh-oh, I'm the Bechor. And if I don't take action, I'll be responsible. Where does Rabbi Nechemia get his reading from? Why is this his conjecture? If we say that Rabbi Yossi's conjecture is that Yosef wasn't there, why is Rabbi Nechemia's conjecture that he was the firstborn? And that he says, I'm the firstborn, if I don't take care of this, it's going to be my fault.
If it was Ish El Achiv, then they were all there talking to one another.
Yes, and he was there too. So why Where's Rabbi Nechemi getting it from?
He says, Lo nakenu. We won't kill him. He puts in the
Yes, we're going to have
plural.
to talk about this, but where does he get the idea that what pops into Reuven's mind is I'm the big brother?
He saves them.
Vayetzilehu miyadam. He hasn't
No,
actually.
it says that he saves him, but what Rabbi Nechemi is saying, I think this is what he was thinking. Where does he get it from? Okay, he has to speak to them. Nobody's thinking like him. Can I give you a suggestion?
But he's taking command.
When he comes back,
Well, that's very interesting because if you'll notice, nobody pays attention to him.
At the end of Kaf Bet, it says, Leman Hatzil Oto. He wants to
Yes,
save
that's
him.
true. We have to ask ourselves what's going on there also. Take a look.
Lahashivo, to bring him back. He's going to bring him back. It's his responsibility.
Take a look at Pasuk Lamed, ladies and gentlemen, verse 30. Take a look at verse 30. No,
No?
No, Vayashav el Echav,
He
he
comes-
wasn't with them. He wasn't
no,
a part of the flock.
that's another question we have to ask. But what does he call Yosef?
The yellow.
Yeled.
A Yeled.
Why not?
Yeah.
Doesn't mean he's the Bechor.
Think about it for a moment, ladies. How old is Yosef at the time of this story?
Teenager.
Yeah,
He's a teenager and he's called Hanar.
yellow.
Who's the only one who sees them as a kid?
The older brother.
The big brother.
Any of the bigger brothers would have seen
No.
it that way.
No, they see him as a murderer. They see Yosef as an evil, evil man. Only Reuven sees him as his baby brother.
Hmm.
By the way, in later in Sefer Breshit, when they are talking to Yosef, talking in front of Yosef, thinking Yosef doesn't understand them, he says to them, I told you, Al techteu bayeled, don't sit against the boy. He's a classic big brother. He's a classic big brother. Okay, well, we're going to stop here. We have a lot more to do. If you want to spend some time on this, on your own time to think about the implications of what's the opinion of Rabbanan, where did they get their ideas from, and the connection that the Midrash makes later to something else, that might be a good use of your time before next week. Okay, so I'm sorry we don't have more time, but Bezrat Hashem, see you next week. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So we'll pick up on the questions next week. There are a few questions here at the end. Okay, thank you very much. 12:15 in about 13 minutes, Dr. Benny Gesundheit will continue his part on Tehillim. If you have yet to attend, I encourage you. Very creative, original readings of Sefer Tehillim. I guarantee you, like you've never seen before. I don't think like anybody's ever seen before. Very interesting intertextuality, all kinds of approaches. That will be at 12:15. Tomorrow, of course, 3 shiurim. Marty Lakshin concludes his series, his 6-part series on biblical commentaries they didn't teach you in yeshiva. The second part, Rav David Tzvi Hoffman. Lori Novak continues with her series on women and ritual textual analysis. The second part on tzitzit. I encourage you to come to everything whenever you can make it, when you can come. And if I didn't think the classes were good, we wouldn't offer them. And then after Lori Novak, tomorrow night, 8 p.m., we will have our class on the Haftarah of the week, also very interesting. Moshe Sokolov, Thursday morning, Zev Elif at 11 o'clock, Getting a Footing in America. Turkey and Torah, whatever we call it exactly, Turkey, Torah, and Thanksgiving. And we don't eat turkey here, because our Canadian, we only eat turkey in October. And then at 12:30, Ari Sivitovsky will be giving class on the kashrut of Turkey. I'm sure many people know it's not so clear why turkey is kosher. Maybe it's not. Maybe don't come to the class if you're having a turkey dinner, but I think you can still come, even if you're planning to eat turkey. And Thursday night, Rabbi Daniel Daniel Koropkin, the rabbi of debate here in Toronto, and the president of the RCA, the Rabbinic Council of America, will be giving our weekly Parsha Shir. So that fills out the week, and we look forward to seeing you. Take an 8-minute break, get a cup of coffee, some orange juice, some toast, whatever.
Yay.
And yes, come for Dr. Benny's class.
If